For this video, we'll go through the configuration and how to set up port forwarding. Here is the network topology that we will be working on. This is somewhat similar to the topologies that I have presented from my previous videos. I just removed the Proxmox internal connections in here to have a cleaner look. When you really wanted to know how I set this up, here is what it looks like in the back end with the virtual switches, network interfaces, and how they are interconnected. You can refer to my previous videos explaining the details. Then someone asked in the comment section how to access Server 2022 or Windows 11 from this management PC, and if you can make a video. This one is for you then. My objective here is to manage every device or service that is behind the firewall, and including the firewall web admin itself from this management PC. To achieve this, we'll use one of the features of the firewall that is port forwarding. There are other ways of doing this like using a remote access VPN, but we'll focus on port forwarding for this one. Port forwarding is allowing an inbound traffic distant to a public IP address on a specific port or service and forward that to an internal device. That is just my short definition of it. Take note that this is a WAN simulated environment, and I'm not using a public IP address in here. This is a lab environment for demonstrating port forwarding. But again, let us pretend that this 192.168.8.210 is our quote-unquote public IP address given by the ISP. And also let us assume that this management PC, or we can call this remote PC, could be anywhere out in the internet. I'm at the management PC in here, and this is also where I can manage the Proxmox box. These are the 4 virtual machines that we will be using for the setup. pfsense firewall. The WAN IP assigned to this is 192.168.8.210 and has a LAN IP of 192.168.1.1. Firewall web management is listening on port 443 or the HTTPS service. Windows 11-1 has an IP address of 192.168.1.10 with RDP enabled and hosting the Unifi controller. Windows 11-2 has an IP address of 192.168.10.100 and RDP is enabled on this machine as well. Server 2022 is on 10.10.10.220 IP with RDP and Web IIS enabled. I have a physical Linksys switch with the management IP of 192.168.1.205 listening on port 443 or HTTPS. A Unifi AP is connected to the switch with an IP of 192.168.1.100 that has SSH enabled. Let us look at our goals in here. We have 7 goals. First goal is to access the firewall web management on this assigned WAN IP 192.168.8.210 via HTTPS or port 443. This is the only part that will not use port forwarding at all, since it's the firewall WAN IP itself that we are trying to get access to on port 443 or HTTPS. The rest here will be using port forwarding. Second, access server 2022 via RDP, and RDP service is by default listening on port 3389. Third, access Linksys switch web management on port 443 or HTTPS. Let's see if we will encounter an issue on this one. As you notice, the firewall is also accessible on port 443 or HTTPS. Fourth, access Unifi Controller Web Management on port 8443, hosted on Windows 11-1. Fifth, access Unifi AP on port 22 or SSH. Sixth, access both Windows 11-1 and Windows 11-2 via RDP. Looks like we will have an issue here with the same default RDP port 3389. Server 2022 is also on the same RDP port 3389. Last on the list, access web service via HTTPS or port 443 hosted on server 2022. We'll go through each one and see how it goes. On to the first goal, access firewall web management. Let us attempt to access it by typing https://192.168.8.210 from this management PC. The site can't be reached. By default, pfsense web management is allowed to be accessed only on the LAN interface. We need to go to Windows 11-1, which is behind the LAN, and access the LAN IP 192.168.1.1 to get to the web management, and then add a firewall rule to allow web management over the WAN. Back in Proxmox web management, select Windows 11-1. Let us open Edge browser. Type in here https://192.168.1.1. We are getting this privacy error saying your connection isn't private, and that is because of pfsense self-signed certificate, which the browser does not know about. We can just ignore this for now, click Advanced, then Continue. Go to Firewall and select Rules. There is no configured firewall rule under WAN, and therefore all incoming connections on this interface will be blocked. In the LAN section, the top firewall rule here is the pre-configured rule for web management access to destination LAN address, that is 192.168.1.1 on port 443 HTTPS or port 80 HTTP. Let us add a rule under WAN that will allow web management distant to the WAN IP address or the supposed public IP 192.168.8.210 on port 443 or HTTPS. Action is pass, interface is WAN, address family is IPv4, protocol is TCP. For the source, this is the source IP address where the request is coming from. You can make this specific. However, for now, I will just leave it as any. For the destination, select WAN address, which is the object name for the IP address assigned to the WAN interface, that is 192.168.8.210. For the destination port range, select HTTPS 443 in the From field, and automatically it will auto-populate the same value in the To field. Add a description. I'll say this is for firewall web management over WAN. Then click Save and apply changes. Let's see if we can access the pfsense web management now via the WAN IP. This is working. First goal achieved. Next on the list is to access server 2022 via RDP. This is where we start to configure port forwarding in pfSense. Back to the firewall web admin, go to firewall and select NAT. Under port forward, click add. Interface is WAN, address family is IPv4. For protocol, select TCP because RDP is a TCP port. For destination, leave it as the WAN address, which is again the object name for the IP address assigned to the WAN interface, that is 192.168.8.210. For destination port range, in the From port field, select the built-in object for RDP, which is MSRDP. This is on default port 3389. The to port field is already auto-populated with the same value. For redirect target IP, enter the internal server 2022 IP address 10.10.10.220. For redirect target port, select the same MSRDP since server 2022 is also listening on the default RDP port 3389. Add the description. I'll put in here server 2022 RDP. For NAT reflection, leave it as use system default. We don't need NAT reflection in here. For filter rule association, the default is add associated filter rule, which means once this port forwarding NAT rule is saved, a firewall rule will be automatically created under WAN, allowing the traffic to the internal device. Click Save and apply the changes. We have now created our first port forwarding NAT rule. Incoming TCP traffic to WAN interface from any source or any port going to destination WAN address 192.168.8.210 on destination port 3389 or RDP will be redirected to the internal IP 10.10.10.220, which is the server 2022 on the same port 3389. If you notice, there is a symbol for linked rule. The linked rule here is the firewall rule. In the firewall rules section under WAN, this is the auto-added firewall rule that is linked to the port forwarding NAT rule. This rule is allowing the traffic going to destination 10.10.10.220 on port 3389. This linked firewall rule also has an auto-added description. As you can see in here, NAT server 2022 RDP. If we trace the traffic, this management PC will attempt an RDP connection to the public IP 192.168.8.210 on TCP port 3389. pfSense firewall will first look at the NAT port forwarding rules, whether this incoming connection has a match or none, and if it does match, pfSense will inspect further, and this time it will check on the firewall rules whether it is allowed to pass to the internal IP or not. Let us verify if we can access server 2022 via RDP. I'll be using this remote desktop manager application by Devolutions. It is a free program and want to try it out. If you want to try this too, I'll share the link in the description. Click this plus sign to add a new entry and we'll select RDP or Microsoft Remote Desktop. I'll name this as Server 2022 RDP. For the host, this is the WAN IP address 192.168.8.210. The port here is already set to default 3389. I'll enter the admin credential of server 2022. Then click Add. We can right click and select Open Session, or double click on it and it will open the RDP session. We are able to connect an RDP session to server 2022. Goal 2 achieved, right? While we are here, let us add an entry for the firewall web management session. Click the plus sign to add a new entry and click website because we're accessing this over HTTPS. I'll name this pfsense firewall. For the website, enter the URL address https://192.168.8.210. Then click Add. Double click this pfsense firewall entry in here that we just added. There is a message saying the site security certificate is not trusted, and this is again because of the firewall self-signed certificate. We can click proceed anyway, just like what we did earlier. I'll sign in and confirm that we have web admin access to this firewall. So we have access to server 2022 via RDP and pfsense firewall web management over HTTPS. The idea here is to have a centralized access using one application installed on this management PC. Next goal is to access Linksys switch web management via HTTPS or port 443. Take note that firewall web management is on HTTPS or port 443 as well. There is a conflict with the port number. We'll just proceed anyway in creating the port forwarding NAT rule and we'll see how it goes. Interface is WAN, address family is IPv4, select TCP for the protocol, destination is still the WAN address. For the destination port range, from port field I'll select HTTPS and the to port field will auto-select HTTPS. For redirect target IP, enter the IP address of the Linksys switch that is 192.168.1.205. For redirect target port, select HTTPS. Added description. This will be Linksys switch web management. Then click save and apply changes. This is our second port forwarding NAT rule wherein when traffic is destined to the same WAN IP address on port 443, it will redirect to the internal switch IP 192.168.1.205 on the same port 443 or HTTPS. We still have this linked rule symbol, which means there is an auto-created firewall rule associated for this traffic. In the firewall rules section, this is the linked rule which will allow traffic to the destination switch IP on port 443 or HTTPS. Notice the similarity of the linked firewall rule that it starts with the word NAT in the description. Let us set up a web session and I'll name this Linksys switch. Enter URL address https://192.168.8.210 and click add. As you notice, this is exactly the same as the firewall web management URL address. What do you think will happen here? I'll open a web session for this Linksys switch. Looks like we have access to the switch web management. How about the pfSense firewall web management? I'll click on this refresh icon. It is still accessible. Maybe it's still remembering the connection. I'll close the pfSense session and relaunch it. This time it redirects to the Linksys switch web management. So in the browser here, I'll click refresh. Now it redirects as well to the Linksys switch web management. So we have lost access to the firewall web management. Why is this happening? When this management PC initiates a connection to the WAN IP 192.168.8.210 over HTTPS, the incoming traffic received by the firewall will get inspected first from port forwarding NAT rules. There is a match on the destination WAN IP and port 443, therefore it will redirect to the switch internal IP. What is happening here in the firewall is that port forwarding NAT rule will take effect first before the firewall rule. Because we don't have access anymore to the firewall web management over WAN, let us go to Windows 11-1 machine and access the firewall over the LAN IP. If we examine the port forwarding NAT rule again, this is the last entry that we have added for the switch web management. This has a linked firewall rule. When this port forwarding rule matches the incoming traffic received at the WAN interface, the linked firewall rule will be applied to the traffic. So this firewall rule at the top that is destined to the same WAN IP address on the same port 443 for firewall web management will never match. So what is the solution here if we are limited to use only one public IP address? We can use port address translation or PAT. This is basically the same as port forwarding and will just tweak the destination port. I'll try to explain this in the topology here. This management PC is initiating a connection to the destination WAN address 192.168.8.210 on destination service HTTPS or port 443. The way we access this is by entering the URL address in the browser https://192.168.8.210, or we can do it this way, adding :443. We don't necessarily place :443 because it's understood already that HTTPS is 443. The plan here is to change the destination port from 443 to 4433, or we can use any port number as long as there is no conflict. The way we access this now from the web browser is https://192.168.8.210:4433. The firewall examines the incoming connection, and let's say we have already a port forwarding rule on port 4433, it will redirect this to 192.168.1205 on HTTPS 443. Port 4433 is translated to 443. This is port address translation. In this way, we can access the firewall web management on port 443 HTTPS as is, and access the switch web management on port 4433. Let us go back to the firewall port forwarding NAT rules, edit this switch web management rule, And what we need to change here is the destination port range. Change it from HTTPS to other, and this will enable to add a custom port. Enter 4433 on both from port and to port custom fields. That's it. Leave everything as it is. This port forwarding NAT rule distant to WAN address on port 4433 will redirect to switch IP on port 443 or HTTPS. The linked firewall rule is still the same. Let us test this on the web browser. Enter https://192.168.8.210. We got our access back to the firewall web management. For the switch web management, I'll enter https://192.168.8.210:4433. And it is accessible as well. In the remote management application, let us edit first the links switch, right-click and select Properties. Add :4433 in here, then click Update. Double-click links switch to launch a web session. Switch web management is accessible. Launching a web session for the pfSense firewall also is a success. We are done with this third goal. Next on the list is to access Unifi controller web management. The Unifi controller is hosted on this Windows 11-1 and is listening on TCP port 8443. Let us add port forwarding NAT rule. Select TCP for the protocol. Same destination WAN address. For the destination port range, this will be a custom port number. Select other in the from port field. I'll enter in here 8443 for from and to port as custom. For redirect target IP, it is the Windows 11-1 IP address 192.168.1.10. For the redirect target port, same custom port 8443. Add a description. This is for Unifi controller web management. Leave everything below as default. Verify the port forwarding NAT rule is correct and confirmed we have the auto-created linked firewall rule. I'll add a new entry in Remote Desktop Manager application for the Unifi controller web management. The website URL address is https://192.168.8.210:8443. Unifi controller is accessible. Goal 4 check, 3 to go.